Well, I was just saying good evening and welcome everybody to this edition of the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. It's a bit awkward and it's a bit anxious, but still one is happy to be presenting the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival on the digital platform this year. A festival that has taken shape and has been important for the urban space, urban city, public realm of Mumbai, questions of urban advocacy, recovering and rejuvenating public sphere and public space. I think these have been some of the crucial and most important aspects of the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. And in all these many years, it's only got reinforced stronger and stronger. In that context, it's also good that we didn't skip this year and we've continued, even if it's in a small way, on the digital platform. And I'm happy that the architecture event, the urban design and architecture event that we are doing this year is with Rahul Mehrotra. And for most Bombay or even India audiences, he's not a name that would need much of an introduction. But it's important that Rahul has been a crucial and an important part of setting up not only the Kala Ghoda Association, but also the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. And it's only important, beautiful. Today it closes a circle in a way when Rahul is presenting his most recent and new book, Working in Mumbai, where literally the lives of Rahul Mehrotra as an urban theorist, an urban researcher, an urban activist meet his practice, his work, and his sort of thoughts in the sphere of architecture practice. Rahul has been an important figure, an important person, an important voice for not only all of us in Bombay, but across India, but specifically for Bombay, for the way he has presented various aspects of urbanity, various aspects of city history, and various aspects of architecture to all of us. Thinking about architecture through the broader realms or the broader constructions of architecture in contemporary India. On the other hand, his various books, his various writings on urban history, on the history of Mumbai, navigating fort walks, visiting various places in Mumbai. And I think it's important to point out that there are very few practices across architecture history, across architecture practice in the world, where very few individuals are able to combine an active architecture practice with an equally active and independent research career. Obviously, no doubt, research careers in such cases, their research career and their practice careers are going to overlap. But I think it's important that they are as much independent careers as much as there may be overlaps in those careers. And I think it was 2 years ago that Rahul did an exhibition around his work at the GST, where there were interesting presentations or interesting corners in that exhibition, which brought his research work, his writing work, his books in context of his practice. And some of the important conversations, I think, are already in this book. In a way, the setting up of RMA, the architecture practice of Rahul Mehrotra, which is completing 30 years this year, comes together at a point where at the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival, and in that sense, an architecture practice that has been spread all over the country, but also to places outside of India, is coming back to the locality, to the neighborhood of being in Bombay. And I think this juxtaposition is going to be interesting for many of us to see as we read along his book, read from his experiences, and also are able to sort of to share and learn from him what this experience of traversing the world, making the world your home at one point in time, but at all points in time, then returning to the locality and the neighborhood of Bombay. With this broad introduction to the book that we are collected here for today, I'll just do a very brief formal introduction to Rahul and then hand it over to him to present this book, and then we will move into a discussion and conversation. So Rahul Mehrotra is the founder principal of RMA Architects. He divides his time between working in Mumbai and Boston and teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he is professor of urban design and planning and the John T. Dunlop professor in housing and urbanization. That's the most dry introduction that you can have to to Rahul, but there are many more details, and I think there would be many friends and many colleagues that we know in the audience, and I think we've all had various and very important conversations and interactions with Rahul, and that's what makes Rahul an urban character for us in the sense of the Jane Jacobs idea, or Michel T. Dunier's idea in The Sidewalk on New York, where they talk about the urban character. And I think in that sense, let's have Rahul today as the urban character who is also the architect in contemporary India. Rahul, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaiwan. You can hear me now, right? Yeah. Yeah. And I have to, is my screen visible, or I need to do something? Okay, thank you, Sonam. So thank you very much. And thank you, Kaiwan. I know it's, I would feel as awkward introducing you as you were feeling introducing me. So I think that's mutual consent. But thank you very much for all your kind words and the onus you've put on me on various fronts. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for, having invented and shepherded this architectural component in the festival. It just gives us all as professionals a wonderful forum to interact. So thank you for that. And thank you, Brenda, also for initiating this invitation with Kaiwan and Sonam for all your support. So look, let's start and let's jump into this. I think this book will, it's being published by Sept University Press, and it should be in India by about March. And so these discussions, I think, are good preludes to, I hope, what we'll do as a launch formally when copies are more easily available. But thank you, Kaiwan, for doing this first discussion around the book, I think, in the country. So wonderful that we could do this together. So this book is called Working in Mumbai, and I think, as Kaiwan mentioned, it's a way of my touching base and stone. Touching base with Mumbai in all these sort of iterative loops. And we'll discuss that in more detail, I hope, in the discussion. But the first words in the book is, this is not a monograph. And this is really a provocation to us as a profession about how we conceive even putting our work out in the world. And I really do mean it. I mean it both as a provocation, because you could argue it is a monograph, but I say this is not a monograph. Because for me, monographs have become like eulogies. Monographs have become like, architects getting a bunch of their friends together to write about them. And what are those friends going to say but very good things? And so therefore, I think they become wasted opportunities in terms of how we can critically engage with even our own work and hold it up as a mirror. And therefore, this is really a provocation for us to reflect more rigorously, what I would call single and double loop thinking, where you are in the problem, but you're also outside the problem simultaneously. Can we do that? I think critics do it for us. Critics are in this single and double loop all the time, but can we as practitioners also do it, where we can reflect about our own work, which is not to undermine what critics might do, because critics might look at this even in much more expansive ways. But I think it's also our own, the onus is also on us to be able to reflect, to be able to even reflect on failure, which is what is partly in this book, because I think from failure, we only get stronger. So it's called Working in Mumbai. It starts with this provocation that this is not a monograph, and the book is broken into several chapters. It has an introduction. So the preface is a very long preface. These are 8 to 12,000 word essays. So it's a very text heavy book. It's very visual. But it's also very text heavy because each portfolio of images is also comes with a substantial reflection in the form of an essay. This first introductory framing, it really picks up on the book Architecture in India since 1990. And really, this is designed exactly in the same size. It's actually intended to be a second volume to Architecture in India since 1990. 1990 because, you know, we started liberalizing our economy at that time, and so therefore that book was about looking at what is happening in India in the years after the economy was liberalized, and our practice also started in 1990. So both these books are actually complements. One is about understanding what was happening around the practice, that is the context of the practice. And this second volume, now working in Mumbai, is about the practice and reflecting from within the practice. The other one was for reflecting from outside the practice. And the architecture in India, for me, I think the two or three important things that emerged in that reflection was that one question was, if you remove the lens of modernism, what do you see in the landscape of India? And therefore, even projects like Akshardham and temples and modern temples were included. Many global practices were included, because we have for too long looked critically at India through the lens of modernism. The other question that came out of that was this notion of what should be the models of practice by which we engage with building in India. And the third was the disjuncture in the Indian context, where the aesthetic modernization came before the social modernization project. And so therefore that becomes a real disjuncture, which is worth us looking at rather critically. So this book is divided into really 5 parts. One is called The Architecture of the Interior. The second is called Between the Rural and the Urban, which is looking at the unusefulness of the rural-urban binary. The third is called Constructing Cultural Significance, which is a critique on conservation practices in India. And the fourth is about mediating the local and global, which is again about how one blurs that binary because it has less relevance today. And the last one is again a meta reflection on the context as generator of practice. Why I've called it Working in Mumbai, why context matters. And why context is important, and how do we even understand and read the context? How do we make our agency instrumental within a particular context? And so the architecture of interior is what it says. It's a reflection again on questions of how one can look at interiors architecturally. That's why it's called the architecture of the interior, because when we confront space on its terms, then we move to the architecture of interior from decoration. If we don't confront the architecture that we are doing interiors in, we actually resort to decoration. So it's really a plea about how even interior architecture has a spatial dimension, which is critical, and how interiors actually become crucibles for innovation for all our practices. And working in Mumbai especially, all our practices start with little interior renovations. And how can one again make it more instrumental, both by confronting space, but by making it very mindfully these crucibles for innovations, where new ideas of materiality actually are experimented with in a constructive way for what we are doing. And so it has a taxonomy of all the art spaces that we have done, retail, in this case, restaurants, and just trying to argue how one can look at some of these configurations which come with India globalizing, global capital, and all of that. But how does one actually react to this in terms of even things like retail, and what does it mean? How does one develop a vocabulary? How are these replicable? How do they work with the spatial qualities of what we occupy as space? How it intersects actually, in my view, even with the conservation of space, with memory, and that is embedded in the kind of spaces we confront. And therefore, confronting these spaces on, just going down to the bones of the architecture and starting from there actually opens up a completely different way of imagining interiors, because embedded in these interiors in cities like Mumbai are layers of history, which also make some of these conservation projects, but also create a juxtapositioning between historic memory and the new construction through art and through artistic imagination of the world around us. And so therefore, I think interiors are very critical. This second section, which is about the rural and urban, is broken into 2 parts, which is called the city in the village and living in the Indian city. and therefore argues that these are not mutually exclusive. The simultaneity is what actually characterize our cities, and even what is urban is a question up for grabs. And so here we've talked all the way from what are weekend homes and farmhouses, and what they mean in the context that they sit in, which is essentially urban people interfering and transgressing in a rural context. And therefore, how does one create forms of double coding, which allow these buildings to be read at different levels by both local populations, but also enjoyed by the urban populations that actually construct these. And so this notion of double coding, of how space can mean different things for different constituent members of society, whether they are people who live in that locality, who come from different economic groups, or sophisticated urban people who have completely different aspirations. How do you take simple things like a swimming pool and fold it in without creating transgressions, societal transgressions, because it's a form of ostentation, it's hedonism, and how do you confront these spatial elements that you carry from urban aspirations into a rural landscape? So these essays discuss questions like that. How do you situate these objects in these kinds of landscapes, and what it means, and how do you double code these things in terms of their architecture, in terms of materiality, in terms of its fragmentation of form, scale, many other questions like this. How do you internalize these landscapes of hedonism, like swimming pools, places where urban people frolic in ways that are completely out of tune in conjunction with the rural landscapes where they're situating these objects? And so therefore, the reverse of that also is in cities. That is, how do you actually make these objects in cities? How do you make limited natural landscapes more precious? How do you create a low-key kind of sense of scale, of places of being? How do you take the notion of an angan, which is historic and traditional, but interpret it in modern ways for contemporary life and living? And therefore, how does this get interpreted even in a higher rise configuration as spatial elements? And so these are projects which I won't go into detail, but these are just to give you glimpses of the kinds of things. But the essays that accompany each one of these portfolios of projects attempt to nuance and attempt to interrogate and attempt to articulate the kinds of challenges and aspirations I believe we as architects working in India should be confronting. The third chapter, which is called Constructing Cultural Significance, is really about our conservation projects, but this is the longest essay. It's about 12 or 14,000 words, because it was the hardest one to articulate, because I believe it's a very complicated question. And embedded here are many ideas, starting from, what does even the spectacle of cities mean? If architecture is not the central spectacle of the city, what does it mean to even conserve? What does it even mean to be an architect? And then, of course, here we share our projects all the way from, being involved in mapping the Port District, what Kaiwan alluded to actually doing conservation projects, measure drawings, exhibitions, in this case, the buildings of the Kala Ghoda, what that all meant, and then what it meant to actually make interventions, as in the case, the various interventions we've been involved with in the museum, which are contemporary, which also speak about a time, which also address questions of reversibility, so that you don't lock another generation into a kind of solution of questions, but you don't also compromise bringing contemporary sensibilities to play, which create healthy dialogues also with our own past, and therefore also create forms of social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, and amenities, which is what is part, I think, of our charge. And here, of course, there are a variety of projects, including a conservation plan that we had done for the Taj Mahal. And so this captures in detail what that process was, because it was set up in terms of its structure and protocols. It was also set up in very interesting ways, creating a tripartite arrangement between public and private sector, etc. So there are many lessons there that I think, all the way from materiality and traditional practices to actually the protocols, which are critical, I think, in the context of India. Then the last section, or the second last section, is called Mediating the Local and Global, where the question really asked is, how do you localize the global and how do you globalize the local? And how do local lessons resonate globally, but how do you get global capital, for example, or global programs like corporate buildings and software centers to localize themselves, to make a commitment to the locality? And architecture can really be quite instrumental, I believe, in doing that. In the way you mediate these sort of landscapes. Many projects here, like, for example, the LMW headquarters, which was one of our earliest projects, and 4 years when we were into the practice, finished in 96. But the clients here were very low key, and in our contract, we had an agreement not to ever publish it. So it was never published. So we continued between interiors and small houses. And in between, in the 4th year of the practice, there was this aberration of a 100,000 square foot building, which nobody got to know about till much later when people started seeing it. And this reference came up. So we've celebrated this in the book because it finally gave us the opportunity to do that. And it was a very interesting project because it also was a very early collaboration with artists and architects, because the clients wanted a budget and they wanted art, and we convinced them that we should have art integrated in the building as building elements like railings and grills, and here the design of the waterfall. And with Rajiv Sethi's help, you see a very young Rajiv Sethi in that image, and Manjeet Bawa, who you see working at our site. He took all his figures and he converted them into three-dimensional copper cutouts, which became motifs for the railings, for example. And Rajiv Sethi did this stainless steel flag with 104 Lakshmis, which is the name of the building. And you see Sharad Shah there, the late Sharad Shah, the structural engineer who was part of this whole process. It had an amazing collaboration of all sorts of people. Yogesh Raval here worked with Rajiv Sethi and us. And what we did was we took scrap metal from the LMW machine tool plant, and Yogesh Raval, using the same technique he uses with layering kite paper, actually layered scrap metal to create an array of some 20 jali configurations, which became motifs through the building, really the material that the company built its wealth from. And so it was a wonderful enterprise between us and artists, with Rajiv Sethi acting as a mediator, which formed another way of integrating art in the building. And then, of course, the SEP library, which is a more recent project, but also looking at very local projects like this Campus for Magic bus, which is essentially for kids who live in slums. And how do you actually use the material that is found in slums, but reconfigure it in ways that you can actually build a contemporary building? And so there's a sense of familiarity here, which was something that we were very interested in doing, but also working with Sheila Patel and Spark on developing prototypes for public toilets, or this complicated government project of low-cost housing for mahouts in Jaipur, where we've actually tried to map a trajectory of what that process meant. Context, a generator of practice, is the last essay, which is a reflection, which looks at, the role I played with the UDRI and its revival, the kinds of conferences, lectures, the platforms, the exhibitions, the books, and how books became also instruments, what I call instruments of advocacy, etc. So this is a very kind of long reflective essay where many issues are kind of dealt with. And then what we've done, it's a 40 pages of chronology where we've taken different activities, what Kaiwan was alluding to, which is practice, which is writing, which is research, which is advocacy, which is teaching, and actually creating a graphic where you see them intersect. So you begin to see what work we were doing while the fort area legislation was being at play, or when cities within, which Sharda Devedi, which was a great partnership for me, which I've again celebrated a lot in the book, was happening. What were we thinking in terms of architecture at that point? When did we start doing conservation? There were years where there were no books, but then there were years where there were many books. Like in 2015, we did something like 4 books. In 2014-15, we were doing international competitions, but no books. And so you begin to see this interesting, I think, intersection between things. And then, of course, also a celebration of what is the culture of the studio. And this infographic actually maps everyone who worked, even every intern who worked in the studio, with their contribution and the time they kind of spent there. So the 4 or 5, just in conclusion, the 4 or 5 questions that sort of came up is this notion of the models of practice. So what is the architecture of practice? The second one, through the book, these are the 3 or 4 motifs through the book, is how these binaries need to be synthesized. That design is about synthesizing binaries, not about perpetuating binaries. We tend to make these binaries in a way to situate the world around us, and then we tend to live in one part of this binary, right? But the question as architects is that we are the bridge practices that blurs these binaries. And so if we see ourselves as bridges in society, then what we do is we bridge these practices between public and private, between the state and private, between formal and informal, etc. And therefore, as you can see from the titles of the essays, they are about trying to create this kind of synthetic view of how we look at these binaries. The third one, which is something that came out of really writing the book, was what is the client? The client is actually not a singular entity as we often take it. A client is a patron client, an operational client, a user client. In a single family house, these things all collapse into one entity. And that's why single family homes, except for dealing with the hassles between couples, you have a completely frictionless motion. And that's why we all enjoy it and we celebrate it. Of course, we do our best work in single family homes. But then in government projects and state projects, even in private and institutional projects, these parts of the clients get differentiated. And therefore, the architect's challenge is, again, synthesis, getting everybody's aspirations on the same page. And you could argue the city is your client, the nation is your client, and the globe is your client. So you could also expand it if you're ambitious about it. And then this is something that our colleague Prem Chandarwakar had once sort of pointed out to me, is how do you make an intersection between your sphere of concern and your sphere of influence? And for me, this has been very much central to our practice, which is how do we make these intersections? And so for me, the books, the research, these are instruments by which one not only has a voice, but also identifies the issues, but also is a gesture of generosity to advocates who might use these instruments to advocate for other things. And I believe things like what Kaiwan, Ranjit, and I did, and other collaborations many of us have done, these are instruments of advocacy. These are meant for people to run with. They're not meant to be static kinds of entities. And so really, the whole book is about understanding the context of the context, which is the context of where we operate on the site. Site matters, and so does context matter. But we have to keep nestling the context we work in. In my case, I use Mumbai as being emblematic, but we have to nestle it in the larger context that it's situated in. And so that really is a very brief kind of summary of the book. And with that, I'm going to invite Kaiwan back to ask me the difficult questions.
Very nice presentation. I think for all those who have not yet got their hands on this wonderful book would have got a very clear sense of what the book is about, the purpose and the flow and the experience of the book, the content and the experience of the book. So thank you very much for that presentation. Two questions come to mind immediately. One is if you could elaborate a bit further on why working in Mumbai, why that sort of positionality for making these sets of arguments that you were making. But I would also like to double that question with what's been this journey between the broad context of contemporary India architecture since 1990, which you wrote in 2011, and I mark these dates importantly, to looking at your own practice, stereoscoping it through the lens of Mumbai. So it's 30 years of practice. It's it's approximately that many years of an engagement with the city. You sort of shuttle between places and continents in various avatars constantly, but you give us a sense of what architecture in India is since the 1990s and 2011, and now do a different kind of a reflection, even if it is through your own work and through your own practice. But you preface the city, or you push the city as the main, you push the city of Mumbai as the main sort of position in the book. So if you could answer these questions or elaborate on
Thanks,
some of these thoughts.
thanks, Kaiwan, and I'll go back and forth a little bit. The what I end the book with on the last page, as you know, is actually a quote from Charles, and it really is another way of saying that context really matters. Where he says, architecture is not a queue in which we have to all stand with perhaps the Americans ahead or the Chinese behind. No, each one of us has the opportunity to be at the cutting edge of where we live. No one else can do that for us. It is up to us to understand that opportunity. And so, I think that is an important insight, because really, I think we don't take seriously enough where we are located, and especially in today's world. And I think he also said, he argued in a wonderful essay that architecture is not a movable feast like music is. And we have in our global imagination, what even media has perpetuated, is often making architecture understood as a movable feast, that you can land it anywhere you like, and so therefore, I think for me, context does matter. And it's been over many years that one has understood that as clearly as this. And I think for me, teaching has had a very big part in it. I started using this title to lecture called Working in Mumbai, I think 20 years ago. I think I was first invited, I think it was for a Biennale in Ankara, in Istanbul, which was in the 1995 or 96 or something like that. And, it's interesting. I studied in the US and I came back to India, and I actually virtually didn't use my passport for the first 10 years. I came back in 88, 89. I started work 1990 or 88. And I think I made my first trip outside in 96, besides South Asia. So it was almost a Rip Van Winkle-like feeling, because one hadn't kept up with the debates. I had no interest in teaching. I was writing with Sharda, but it was very much focused on Mumbai, very, very specifically. And so when I had to come up with the title for my lecture, when I was invited to speak, I didn't know what to say. And I kind of really out of the top, I just said, well, I'm just going to talk about working in Mumbai, and that somehow as an emblem haunted me. It haunted me through these years. And I think I have done, and I'm not exaggerating, I've done over 150 lectures called Working in Mumbai, and each one has been slightly different. But that rubric has allowed me to actually keep my feet on the ground. The rubric has allowed me, whether I talk about conservation or interiors or architecture or my writing on Mumbai or theorizing something about the kinetic city, it has reminded me that it's coming from Mumbai. And I think we underestimate how much, if we take what surrounds us and if we take the culture of our city seriously, I think there's a lot that we can extract and learn from it. I have, for example, in the book described how in a place like Mumbai, it's not the academy, it's not, it's actually a group of peers with similar sensibilities that actually become the support group that we learn from. It's in other cities, they're much broader, more formalized cultures of platforms in which these cultures are constructed. We construct that culture even within the profession differently. It's very important to tease all this out, because it only makes you, I think, much more self-conscious about what you need to intervene in and how you need to intervene, etc. And so I would say this is an ongoing thought. I think the ghost still haunts me. I think although one has written this book, I think I'll yet continue to figure out what working in Mumbai means. And I take that very seriously. Even my work outside Mumbai is about reflecting about Mumbai. So
mm,
what I teach at the GSD is about Mumbai. My studios, as you know, about Mumbai, about India more broadly. I mean, I don't mean Mumbai in the
mm, mm, mm.
narrow sense of just the city, but the kind of insight it gives us. To go to your second question, which is slightly linked and yet could be answered
Yes.
separately, is the connection between architecture in India and this book. And, I mean, I have to say this really more on a personal note, and I feel comfortable in a forum like this saying it, is that, after about 15 years of practice, as through more through peer pressure, one was, thinking, oh my God, we should put something together on our work now. We've got enough work to reflect about. And I could never get around to doing anything on our work. So it's taken me 30 years to put anything together on our work. And you know this very well, Kaiwan. And I mean, yes, we've done conversations in Domus, and, some of the work has been published here and there in magazines, but it had never been an obsession, only
Mm,
because I think one was blessed to be so busy with ideas one wanted to explore and do, and because the work took me from conservation to new buildings to writing to doing things, I never had the desire really to write about the work. But in about in 2010, 11, when I also had now finished about 10 years also teaching simultaneously, and there were
mm,
many ideas bubbling, and I don't know, in 10,000 and 2010, when I moved to Harvard, I came here as the chair of the urban planning and design department. So I was going away from architecture. Till then, I'd always been a professor in architecture. I thought, God, this is a good time to write a book on architecture. So I'll remind myself that I'm also an architect, because now I was dealing with planning.
mm,
And so that was the year, my first year as chair, that I took the time and I actually wrote. And I decided to actually first write about architecture in India, which was good. And we kept our own work out of it. And I felt it was the 20 years that I had been part of the profession since 1990. I knew everybody firsthand that I wrote about, most
mm,
people, not everyone. And therefore, I could wear the hat of a critic. And by leaving our own work out of the book, one could be hopefully a little more objective. I mean, there's always subjectivity, I guess. But I think in retrospect, that was wonderful, because that and then, it's interesting. I mean, just for the audience, Taiwan and Ranjit, and we've all known each other for a very long time. But somehow the book Architecture in India 1990 triggered off something. And Kaiwan summoned me to his arbor retreat that he had built himself and said, we've got to discuss the book. And that discussion, I don't know if I remember it going for hours, but it essentially sowed the seeds for SOA,
so yeah.
State of Architecture. And between doing the state of architecture and doing architecture in India, I actually felt prepared to write this book, because
Mm,
I felt that I had done two things. One is I had, I think, understood the context of our work better by understanding what had happened in India
mm,
since 1990, and then you guys made us look at it from independence. And that was one. But the second was, again, on a personal note, I felt that those two endeavors, which were massive undertakings, as you know, was also a way of having given to the profession to now maybe celebrate what we were doing. And so it kind of put me in a mental state where I felt finally comfortable to write about our
mm.
own projects. And of course, this is on a much more personal note. Yeah.
Thanks, Rahul. I think that's important for, I think, at all levels, for historians, for academics, as well as practitioners, in this constantly reflecting and stereoscoping in and out of your own work. And I don't think it's an academic or an intellectual pursuit alone. It's an intellectual pursuit in the notion of practice, in the notion of making. I think, and that details out in the way you discuss very many different projects. And maybe sometime when we have a longer time to even go through a project like, say, Hathigao, or one of those projects, will be interesting to see how this back and forth between the broad scale and the experiences of, say, advocacy in the city of Mumbai would overlap, even if it's a project in say Rajasthan or Basel,
Right.
in that
Right.
way. Uh, So I'm also tempted to ask you this question also. Probably I have an idea that it's both the things, but what I'm wondering is, would you see that as a template to reflect on practices, the location of the practice, where is it? And also because, we've all been people who've advocated or worked around the notion of the metropolis, but you have been one person who's also been telling people that this time and the near future is also going to be in the other towns and cities and not really the metropolis. So in a sense, would you see this as a template to sort of reflect on practice through locations, or would you see this as a biographical? Because I'm uncomfortable with both being easy templates in a certain way. I wouldn't like to see this only as a biography of RMA that can reflect through Mumbai. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to be easy to say that it's a template that every practice can look through its context of the location and the landscape of the cities that one is networked within. How would you talk about this? Because I think for students or practitioners, this is going to be an important question: the sense of location and moving in and out of that location.
No, this is a incredibly important, but also incredibly complicated question. I'm not even sure I feel ready to answer it. One maybe needs a little more distance and retrospection even further to be able to unpack this in the way you're asking. But what I would say is actually both. I mean, I think there are many things here. I think one is, I think what you've already brought up, which is, let me say, it's a template for reflection. That means it's a provocation that we need to reflect. Now, we might conclude that place is important or not important. I've concluded place is important. Someone may not. Someone may feel comfortable traversing many ways, almost like a movable feast. That's fine. That also might have its own relevance. I mean, there are many architects in the world who do just that. And they find other ways to locate and land on the ground. And maybe that is relevant. I don't believe it is, given all the problems we're facing on this planet, but maybe people can make an argument. So the provocation is to reflect. The provocation is to theorize. And the provocation is to create as many intersections as one can of one's lived experiences. One shouldn't isolate architecture from life, right? So let me unpack each of these. It's a provocation to reflect, which is that we can't be lazy about that if we want to grow. If we want to grow not only as individuals, if we want to grow as a profession. Right? Look at the lack, and I know you're frustrated with this, the lack of good criticism. I mean, I know you're going crazy with what you see posted on Instagram. And as you and I have argued that Instagram has become the new equivalent of people sitting in a bar and getting drunk and saying whatever comes in their head, except that we all have to suffer those thoughts. So, I mean, I think rigorous reflection is very critical. It's critical for our growth and the growth of the profession. So I would say it's a template for that, right? I think it's a template for theorizing. And I say it's a template for reflexive action. It's a template for us to be able to articulate why we are doing something, because then we learn from it, but also others learn from it. And I mean, look at cities. We are using the theories from the industrializing West of the last century and actually alluding to that. Actually, new theory on urbanism should come out of India and China, where there's action on the ground, or Africa, etc. And there's not much more of that. So I think part of the provocation is, how do we theorize? How do we reflect? How do we theorize? I mean, I tell you, and quite honestly, writing this book, the people I've had at the center of the mind, the people I've imagined I'm speaking to, are students of architecture, because one feels that it's that reflection of 30 years maybe would be useful for someone not to repeat some of those kinds of directions, right? And also from those reflections come understandings, like I've quoted my colleague Eve Blau in the book a lot, where she talks about how these transitions, because I mean, this the 30 years I've described is also a phase of transition in India where we've transitioned out of socialism. So the first 10 years of our practice, even though I started in 1990, we were yet transitioning out of socialism and we were transitioning into capitalism. Now, these simultaneous transitions occur sometimes for 3 decades, right? So by theorizing that and by unpacking it, you actually realize for what projects, where you situate yourself, how you should intervene, because it's in that phase of that transition, right? The protocols are different, etc. So I think these theoretical frames help us to understand and situate our projects. And then I think it also helps us challenge the notion of consistency. And consistency is a very overused and badly used term in our discussion. People judge architects by the consistency of their vocabulary, which is a completely wrong thing, because for every project you need to respond differently. And so I think by theorizing and by reflecting, you situate yourself better in the world to operate and much more mindful. And so I think those are the kinds of ideas that I think in reflection I can talk about. Yeah.
No, thanks, Rahul. Thank you very much, because I think this discussion is important simply so that the book doesn't become this sort of a template for one to pick up blindly, but to understand that it's a working model that has to be sort of, then each individual locally has to contextualize it or take it in a space of reflection that is extremely to one's biography, connected to one's experience.
And Kaiwan, just to intervene there for a second, I think you framed it really well. And I would say, if a critic had to pick up all that same body of work, they might tell the story completely differently from an outside perspective. And so one has to be mindful of that. And it's multiple readings that I think actually are the critical thing. And so this is a reading of authorship in a sense. So it's one reading of the work. Yeah.
But it's also, I think, Rahul, what is important, whether it was Bombay Cities Within, which has become a classic reference on the city and its urban landscape history, to architecture since 1992, working in Mumbai or even Kumbh. These are books that have come out of constant urgencies that you feel as a practitioner and as an academic. So there are urgencies that come out of practice, but I think the academics is where you sort of very often reflect through studios or projects that you sort of work with the students. And I think this is very important to realize that intellectual reflection in a profession is not the choice that let me this morning, let me now reflect. But it is an ongoing urgency, and it then doesn't become a trophy or an object, but it actually becomes a way of working. It actually is then a contribution to urban life or professional life. I think this is something that is very important to point out, because there is a lot of confusion as to what people understand in terms of urban research or architecture kind of practice research. Yeah.
And you've often said this, and Kaiwan, you've articulated it the best, that research is if you treat research as a product, then you've answered the question before even asking the question, right? Whereas, which is often what happens, and there's a tendency also to relate research specifically to a project. Which I think we all do anyway, of understanding height and how it matters. And so therefore, research is an ongoing rubric that you keep constructing by asking questions, and they get answered in different forums in different ways. They get answered in different projects in different ways. They get answered in different books in different ways. They get answered in different studio projects in different ways. But it's an ever expanding set of questions which loops back on itself. And in that you find the answers. You don't find the answers by setting it as a linear motion,
Yeah. Thanks, Rahul. So, just in the introduction, you also reflect on the different models of practice that have emerged, that you reflect upon in the Architecture Since 1990 book, and somewhere that sort of creeps in the various discussions on your own projects. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Why was it important to see the models of practice and the different kinds of buildings that are coming up? And if you could link that as a second question to the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival, to the Kala Ghoda precinct, and that as a way of sort of shaping a similar question, a model of practice, and the question of the city. So two linked questions.
Yeah. So, I think in the limited time we have, because this could become a lecture in itself, I would say that I think what one understood by looking at models of practice in architecture in India since 1990 was essentially that there were different ways that one could engage with building, and people have been engaging with building. And what essentially differentiates them are the protocols and the processes and the modes of instruction. And I mean, among many other things, I mean, there are many other things that result for it, but for right now, I would just say the modes of instruction are quite different. So, I mean, Laurie Baker's mode of instruction was one sketch, and building a network and an implicit understanding. So let's call that a culture of building, which resulted in projects that had a lot of unpredictability, but it also had predictability in the sense that it was a predictable model of instruction and therefore protocols that made it. uh, Global practitioners sitting in America building here, download or email to you a set of instructions. They have no connection with the maker. They have no connection even with the ground on which they are operating, correct? And then there's a whole range in between that, right? In different modes. In conservation practice, it's a different mode of instruction, and, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it was really understanding that. And then I kind of also realized that many of us, and not our practice alone, but many of us actually, without realizing it, are working simultaneously in different modes. And we don't realize it. And so if we became more mindful of that, then the way we build relationships with the makers of processes, the way we understand even what the client is and unpack that simplistic understanding of the client, etc., how we even look at material configuration, what we think is the aesthetic implications, all of that kind of opens up in a much more organized way for us to understand. And so I think for me, it was really that learning and that understanding that occurred. I mean, I think the Kala Ghoda work, the work on conservation, the expansion of the work of conservation into urban conservation, all of that, I think, came out really of the fact that I had, trained as an urban designer, and therefore one had understood urban design, or at least what I took away from my training in urban design was the notion of a bridge practice, which is that urban design was a practice, not even a discipline, but a practice that made the bridge and created feedback loops between the site specificity of architecture and the abstraction of planning. And therefore, because it was about creating feedback loops, it was about advocacy intrinsically. And so therefore, straddling in the work I was doing in the 1990s with Shyam Chainani and others in the Bombay Environmental Action Group about urban legislation, conservation legislation, was a planning exercise. We were writing legislation, convincing D.T. Joseph to make it a bill, and all of that. And I was very young. I'd just come back after studying. Shyam and others were really the mentors. But then I found that there was a big gap between that abstraction of legislation and what was happening on the ground, because what was happening on the ground was nothing different from what was happening before. So one then started thinking about how does one create those formal improvements on the ground? How does one see the parking lot as a plaza for performance? How does one use the precinct to, create synergy between the infrastructure of art-related things, etc.? And that is truly what urban design is. And this is a very big gap in India, that there's a big gap between the site specificity of architecture, where architects are blinkered-eyed. They are becoming very literate, but in procedural knowledge about the loopholes in the DCR, about clause 3.2.1. It's like there is no conceptual thinking there, because it's all procedural knowledge. And you have a whole bunch of architects who are incredibly good at that. You even have urbanists who are good at that, whether it's a development plan or whatever. But that middle ground of urban design is how do you connect what lands on the ground and what's in a document as abstract policy to really improve the city we experience, I think is the critical thing. So this notion of the bridge practice, I think, came more from the urban design training, but also to see it as a model of practice.
And And just as an ending, could you expand a little bit on the Kala Ghoda experience and the imagination of a festival, which is tied into a certain imagination of resurrection of a city in general, but through a particular precinct, that engagement, which was a more on ground engagement. And I think that also connects the notion of working in Mumbai literally to also close the loop in some way.
So there are many things come together. Again, Kaiwan, this could be a lecture in itself, but I'm going to start with a very personal note and then come to what that imagination was. And that personal note was that the project with which we started our practice literally in August 1990 happened one weekend, literally. And it happened one weekend where the client who was Ram Chatterjee, who had asked me to come to his house in Bandra because he wanted me to help him do the Jahangir Art Gallery through a reference somebody had gave me, signed my agreement. Mrs. Menon was there in the room. And 4 or 5 days later, he passed away. And the poor Jahangir Art Gallery was stuck with me as the architect because their director had already signed the contract. And we got involved in doing, the interior of that one gallery with the movable screens, which is a story in itself. But at that point, what I didn't realize, I was, all of not even 30 and just had come back to Mumbai, and it was my first practice, is that I had actually walked into a hornet's nest because the legal suits, the fights between the Prince of Wales Museum and the Jahangir Art Gallery, who sat on their property, was immense. And Samovar, if you remember, that veranda had chain link fencing because they didn't want anyone from there even coming in. And when I started this renovation, I was summoned by Gorakshakar, who was a very fiery guy. We became very good friends later on for other reasons, but he kind of gave me hell. Then I was summoned by architect Bodhe, who made me stand when I spoke to him because he was in his suit and his tie. So I was confronted with this amazing landscape of Mumbai, where in one district where you had these cultural institutes that had actually Berlin walls between them, and so it left a big impression in my mind. And then a few years later, one got involved with the legislation. We had the first urban legislation in India, and then nothing again was happening on the ground, which is where one, and this is Mr. Sabawala, the late Mr. Sabawala, who I happened to meet and talk to him about this, doing something to improve the area, etc., etc., etc. And the Kala Ghoda Association idea really was born out of that, talking to Shirin Barucha and many others that were finally involved. Sangeeta Jindal. I mean, there were just many people who one summoned then, and everyone was very excited about it. And so it was really, and then those personal memories of these completely antagonistic relationships had stayed with me. And so therefore, the association, I think, came out of 2 or 3 ideas in reflection one can articulate as more clearly. When one was operating intuitively, right? That's why the lived experiences are important. But in reflection, which would not have been possible to do 25 years ago, there were 2 or 3 things that I think it did. One is it asked 2 very important questions. One is, why are we always trying to articulate what is the significance of a place and then try to only reinforce that significance? That's a very static way of looking at it, because culture, if we talk about cultural significance, culture itself is a dynamic category. Culture is always being constructed. So if cultural significance also has to be a dynamic category. Right. And so we said, how do you construct a cultural significance? And therefore, by mapping the many areas in the fort, the banking district, the tourist district, the art district, all of these, we realized that these all had very specific concentrations of contemporary uses, right? That led to the question that could you use these contemporary uses as the drivers of the conservation process, right? As the contemporary engine to drive this. And of course, the art district was the easiest one to band together because all you needed to do is have a coffee or a beer with someone and an idea would grow. And it moved much faster than the others, like the banking district, which resulted in some things around Horniman Circle district and Ballard Estate, which didn't take off for many other reasons, etc. But the art district, took off. And therefore, then the art festival was supposed to be a one-week festival to generate money to conserve the area and to bring visibility to the cultural infrastructure that existed there. I mean, Yeah, so that was really the intent, to do both things, to reinforce the cultural infrastructure, make it more public, therefore many
Yeah.
more things in the public space, and but also to become the contemporary engine to drive the conservation process.
Thanks, Rahul. I think that was an important sort of a summation in a certain way, also because we are in the Kala Ghoda platform, and with this book and also in this digital situation, I think I'm probably the only one here that's literally closest to Kala Ghoda at this point in time. I'm sitting at the
Physically.
Ministry of New, which is again a certain kind of a repurposed space, and the different kind of imaginations that have flowed through spaces like Kala Ghoda, DN Road, VT, and all of them. And I think that was important to connect with this book that you've presented to us and given to all of us working in Mumbai. Thank you, Rahul, very, very much for a wonderful conversation and being so generous and sharing so many of your lived and important experiences with us. Sonam, do we close here, or is there a way of taking one or two audience questions, or do we close here as a conversation? Well, so the indication is we close here as a conversation. So I would say thank you to everybody, to the audience that attended this evening. Thanks, Brinda, Sonam, the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival, and the Kala Ghoda Association team for putting this event together. And thank you, Rahul, for the book and for sharing this time and conversation with us. Thank you so very much. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Kaiwan. Thank you.